Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another edition of The Source 107.9 Radio Fremantle, the radio program which brings you information about everything and anything you need to know about the paradigm we are currently living in. Now, I am Benjamin. My sidekick Robin's not with us at the moment, but I'm going to be leading us through a very, very special interview, the third interview actually, in our installments of pre-recorded interviews with special guests from around the world. Our two previous interviews with Candace Fries, main president and founder of AbundantHope, were very successful, and we have now a third individual coming onto the show, Mr. Ron Chapman. Now, Mr. Ron Chapman is now retired. He was a lawyer. He's been a stockbroker. He's worked in various organizations for government. Born in Bowral, New South Wales. I can't say I've ever had the pleasure of heading down to Bowral, but he's an Australian, and we're going to be talking about the issues tonight of money. We're going to be talking about money, about what it is. We're going to be talking about how it came to be, how we use it in society today, why we need to change the way we use it in society today, and what that'll mean for our future. So, Ron Chapman, are you with us?
Yes, Ben. Thanks for having me on your show.
Oh, wonderful, Ron. Thank you so much for coming on. Now, Ron is also, I didn't mention before, Ron is also the regional director for the organization known as Abundant Hope. And he is, as much as can be in a time like this, an expert on all matters relating to the Australia and New Zealand, and I'm very, very happy to have you on, Ron, to come and talk about some of these things. Now, we're going to get straight on into it if we can, Ron. We're going to move straight ahead into money. Now, this might be a strange question. I'm sure a lot of people wouldn't bother to ask it, but you're gonna tell us a bit about exactly what is money. So I'm going to lead you there to lead straight into it. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Thanks, Ben. Well, money is, of course, everybody thinks they know what it is. In fact, it can be said to be anything will represent value in the facilitation of exchange of goods and services in society. It's an idea translated into community mechanism for facilitating barter, business and commerce. So it's a valuable and currently necessary mechanism for ensuring community health, prosperity, perhaps even abundance, you might argue.
Yeah.
In the past, various commodities have been used as mediums of exchange. They include shells, salt, gold, silver, metal coins, wooden tally sticks. That's an interesting one from
I
England.
I was reading that from one of the excerpts that you sent me of some of your work here. The shells, salt, gold, silver, metal coins, wooden tally sticks. I mean, so basically, you can use anything for money. Money, as we know it, is something that has been chosen. But really, you can use anything. Wooden sticks, my gosh, I mean, that's some kind of
and yet,
method of exchange.
The wooden tally sticks have been one of the most successful money uses, if you like, in history. We could talk about that a bit later on. In fact, for about 600 years in Britain, from around 1100
that was a British invention.
Sorry?
That was a British invention. That was
Yes. Oh. The king decided he needed some way to overcome the shortage of money. He introduced this system where you have a stick, you divide it down the middle with indentations and so on each side, and you give the other party one and you keep one. And the king used to give those out in exchange for goods and services, and then they were used by the people as, in effect, mechanisms for exchange. They represented the value, and you couldn't cheat because no two sticks matched. Only the second half of a given tally stick would match.
Yeah, I see how it works. Yeah, and that was Henry I, wasn't it?
I think it was around 1100 AD.
That's right. Yeah.
And the system was so successful, in fact, that for a couple of hundred years there, the peasants in society were able to work for only 14 weeks a year to earn enough to keep their family. And the rest of the time, they were able to do whatever they liked. And this was the period in which they built great cathedrals, for example. They were all done with voluntary labour because people had so much time on their hands. That seems amazing to us because we are in a society where we're driven to work day and night, in effect.
Yeah.
But in those times, they were good times, and people also studied, and there was sort of local schooling, and it was really a high time. In fact, the tally stick system is arguably the reason why the Renaissance period became so effective. It wasn't just the new information coming from the Middle East. It was also the fact that they had economic good times because they didn't have usury. The system avoided usury, and the king refused to allow it. In fact, the Jewish usurers were banished from Britain, or England at least, in 1294 AD, and they didn't really get back for some hundreds of years. And when they came back, eventually in around 1680s, they helped William become king.
William of Orange, huh?
Yeah, that's right. He was encouraged by the Jewish bankers in Holland, and when he got to power, he granted a new franchise to, in effect, the Jewish bankers, which became in 1694 it became the Bank of England.
That was the first fractional reserve system, wasn't it, for England?
Yes. It was only 2-1 then, whereas nowadays typically it's 9-1 or better. What that means is that you can lend far more than you've got. In that case, it started out as only twice as much as you have. Yeah. But I mean, you can see the fraud in that, and that has burgeoned into the system we know, which has virtually destroyed our world.
And it's interesting too. I'm reviewing some of the work that you've done here, and the amount of time and effort you put into some of these essays is quite detailed. I wanted to ask you about a couple of aspects. There's one thing here you mentioned in one of your works. Money is the lifeblood of society and performs the same function as blood cells does in your body, carrying food and oxygen to every cell and carrying away the waste products to sustain life. The blood system is actually a transport system. Money may also be compared to a transport system. I guess that's pretty accurate, isn't it? I mean, money as it stands today, as it has in the past, and any civilized culture really does rely on this circulatory system, as it were, of money to operate, doesn't it?
It does, and that's the system which is passing. It operated in the last 2,000 years, and indeed before that. It was probably invented at least 6,000 years ago in Babylon, but it's a system which can be very useful to facilitate trade and interaction, but it's not essential in the sense that when you think about it, at the very basic level, money is not useful at all. If you take the family as the family and the extended family as a typical example of humanity, then it would be absurd to require that the members of the family should charge each other for goods and services that they share.
Yeah. And also, too, you mentioned, I wanted to just clarify this. I think this is really important for the listener, so maybe you could comment a bit about this. The idea that money itself is a medium of exchange. It's something that people can use. It's something of a luxury in that you don't need to carry around a large amount of assets, as it were. Maybe it's 5 donkeys or 3 sheep or, a bundle of sticks or something that you would use to exchange. Rather, it just makes commerce and barter a lot more feasible and easy. Now, it's a method of exchange but not necessarily debt, right? There was money without debt previously.
Yes, well, that was an example of the sticks used by the English for those hundreds of years. The tally sticks were credit; they weren't debt. What has happened is with 1694, with the introduction of fractional reserve banking, money started to be created as debt, and so it's not really money. You know, if you've got shells, salt, gold, silver, coins, tally sticks, then you have a positive item. But if you can only create money through a bank which issues it as debt, then it's not really money. I don't know if we want to get into that mechanism at this stage. Perhaps we should.
Well, I was going to mention, Ron, that the money as a form of exchange, rather than as a credit, so to speak, rather than money as a debt, is an important clarification that needs to be done, I think. So up until the fractional reserve banking system, which I think it should be our next topic coming up. So just clarify, before fractional reserve banking, money functioned as a system of credit rather than as debt. Is that what you're saying? Am I understanding that right?
Well, in general, that would be true. Obviously, there were bankers who were trying their luck in all sorts of ways for probably thousands of years before that. But during the period 1500 to about 1780s in Britain, and to some extent, to a fair extent in Europe, usury was banned or not encouraged, which meant that you didn't have this so-called money as debt floating about.
Was this money as credit system usually implemented by certain societal organization? What I'm trying to say is, for instance, Henry I, back in 1100 AD, he brought together his stick tally system, and he was obviously the king. I mean, historically speaking, are you aware, Ron, was it that role generally made functional by kings and governmental agencies, or was it done privately? Do you know?
Well, I'm not fully sure on that, Ben, but for example, the empire in Constantinople, which existed for from the time of Constantine in 315 through to about the 1670s.
Yeah.
Basically, it survived because it excluded Jews from any positions in government and power and banking and medicine and so on. And so the system survived.
As a form of credit, is that what you're saying, rather than the debt?
Well, the king would, and this is what we should do, any money should be issued by the community. In the case of, in the early days, that would have been the king.
Right.
Today, it should be, for want of a better word, a government structure, but basically it should be by the community whose representatives really do represent the views and ideas of the people they represent.
The general people, yeah. Right.
Yeah, and that's the only viable way to issue money. You must have a system which is carefully controlled. It must be audited. It must be clearly seen what happens. It should be limited as to the amount of money that is issued, and that should be carefully controlled. And ideally, money should be recalled on a regular basis so that you keep the value of money consistent. One of the features of money as a medium of exchange, or of anything as a medium of exchange, is that its whole purpose is not to be a store of value, but to be a mechanism for circulation of in society to create goods, to encourage the exchange of goods and services. Now, the faster that so-called money mechanism operates, the velocity at which it operates determines how effective your money system will be. And the problem with, say, gold and silver in particular, but also the whole idea of money today, is that people hoard it.
Yeah,
bankers, of course, control and hoard it.
Right.
And so it's not used as a medium of exchange as such, or not primarily. It's used as a mechanism for control.
Okay.
And that's what has to, if we continue with the money idea, and in the short term we'll have to, I guess, we have to completely delete the idea of usury and of hoarding and of control. Money is purely and simply a means to encourage people to exchange goods and services. That's what it should be, and that's all it should be.
Right. And I think, well, that's fairly clear, Ron. Now, I'm going to ask if we can, at a little bit later point, to come back and talk about some of the things that we can do to form a more correct and fair and even-handed system of money exchange. You started outlining some steps there. I'd like to go back to that again a little bit later, but can we move forward now? You talk about in a lot of your work, and it's your work, but it's a lot of people, a lot of researchers and people involved in these processes have done a lot of research about this. So the fractional reserve banking system. Now, we've discovered that the money system in a more fairer and just mechanism would operate as a system of credit, but that is not the system we operate in today. As you could probably confirm for us, we currently operate in Australia, but not only in Australia, through the Central Bank of Central Banks, Federal Reserve in the US, we function under a fractional reserve banking system. Now, could you maybe elucidate for me and for our audience a little bit about what exactly is a fractional reserve banking system?
That's that's the second part of the scam. The first part, of course, is that governments typically grant to private individuals, well, private corporations, the right to create money out of nothing.
So that's a big one, right? This is a big problem.
That's the first step to note. It's created out of nothing. It means once you've got fractional reserve, it means you haven't got to have all the money you say you lend, and that's creating it out of nothing. Fractional reserve banking started in our modern times in 1694 with the Bank of England, where they had a 2-to-1 ratio. They could lend twice as much as they had in store. Nowadays, it is typically 9-to-1, although in fact, my understanding is that, say, in America and various places, it's probably 100-to-1 and so on, because of the way they operate the derivative system and so on. But you can see the problem. If you haven't got the money, then it's a fraud to lend it. The real problem, though, with fractional reserve banking is that it only creates money out of nothing if and when someone wants to borrow money. If you haven't got a borrower, you don't have any money. When the borrower goes to a bank, say you want $100,000 to buy a home, you go to the bank and they insist upon you signing a contract. Before they do anything, you have to sign a contract agreeing to not only repay the $100,000, but also interest on it. Let's say, it's 10%, make it easy. So once you've signed that, which is your credit, you're standing behind that contract, the bank then goes to a computer and types in $100,000 into your account. In other words, it does nothing. It creates nothing. It contributes nothing. So there and then there's fraud. It's not a legitimate contract because there is no consideration by the bank. There's nothing given by the bank in return for the promise to pay $100,000 plus interest.
So you're saying, Ron, that it's basically it's not a fair trade. You're going
it's
to
a fraud.
Yeah, right.
And it's only acceptable because society accepts it. And society accepts it because from top to bottom, our system is designed that way, and the powers that be and all their flunkies go along with it. And of course, ordinary people don't know any better. For instance, at our schools, we are never taught about money and what it is and how it operates. I'm sure most people have no idea what fractional reserve banking is. The fraud doesn't necessarily stop there either. If you're getting a mortgage, you may well get a mortgage at a variable interest rate. Now, what that means is the contract has in it a clause which says the bank can vary the interest rate at any time at its discretion without your consent. Mm-hmm. Now, that again makes the contract null and void in effect. It's not a valid contract because one of the crucial terms is not knowable at the time. Mm-hmm. Now, again, in a genuine system where the authorities were honest, that could not take place, and the judicial system could not condone it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But those frauds are routine in the fractional reserve banking system, which is run by central banks in virtually every country in the world. I think there are only 3 countries now that they've destroyed the Libyan central bank and made it into a Rothschild central bank.
Yeah.
There are only 3 left. I think Iran is one.
Syria and is it North Korea?
North Korea probably. I'm not sure Syria is even.
No.
But that's what they do. It's a vast global criminal conspiracy, really.
And so, just clarifying, for Australia, we have obviously the Australian Federal Reserve Bank.
Is that the Australian Reserve Bank? Yes.
Yeah. Is that a government agency?
It was set up in 1959 as a corporate statutory corporation by the Commonwealth Parliament.
So it's a corporation.
But you've got to remember that the Australian government is a corporation too, listed on the American Stock Exchange. I mean,
yes, that's a whole other topic we could go into. Yeah.
And so, in theory, the Reserve Bank of Australia is subject to oversight by the Australian Parliament. In truth, of course, it isn't. It's oversighted by presumably the American the Reserve Bank in America, and also the ECB in Europe and so on, and the BIS. The people in charge of the Reserve Bank of Australia would really take their writing instructions from the banking system and not from our government and not from our people. An example of how they disregard the Parliament is that the only oversight given is 2 half days a year. The person in charge of the Reserve Bank of Australia will go to Parliament and tell them what he wants to tell them, whatever he feels like telling them, in effect. And that's and it doesn't matter what the Parliament wants to do. And in fact, under the previous Liberal government, they made a virtue of saying back in 1996 that the Reserve Bank of Australia was now totally independent and it was free from political interference. That's how they sell it to the population. But what they're really saying to the Australian people is the Reserve Bank of Australia is a private or a corporate central bank that is part of a system of central banks which run our world, and which the Australian people have no say in what they do. And that's supposedly a benefit.
You know what's most striking about what you're saying, Ron, and the information that you've given me, if I can just try to illustrate it, the idea that there is a certain amount of asset or a certain amount of credit or intrinsic value on a bank balance sheet, and they have been given the charter, they have been given the functionality to lend out or to increase that borrowing rate. They can lend out however many times, 9 times, 10 times, like you've mentioned, and like I've seen in other sources as well, that multiplication rate in the United States can be anywhere up to 30 times, as far as I've seen, at least 30 times. Now that is an incredible power, that is an incredible function to be sitting in the hands of a private corporation working in its own interest and not for the people. When you mentioned that the proper application of a money system should be by and for the community for which it serves, it would seem therefore anathema that we would have private companies that are working for their own best interests in charge of creating or distributing money creation throughout our communities. I mean, that whole idea, just sitting here thinking about that idea, is abhorrent. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make logical sense for a community to be served by a privately run, special interest group which has no particular bent to needing to service a community in a fair and just way, other than to service its profits and the profits of its shareholders. I mean, it does sound to me, Ron, it does sound absurd, and yet this is the operational system that we're currently working with. Would you say that's a fair?
It is. You're correct, and it is absurd. And the only reason that it, just like so many other things in our society, continues is because people do not understand, and they do not understand because the money that's been made by the bankers globally over hundreds of years has been channeled into all sorts of control mechanisms, such as the education system and the university system and the granting of money to academics and scientists and so on, so that the whole system has been suborned and corrupted. People will not get jobs, they will not get grants and so on unless they don't rock the boat. You'll almost never find anybody telling you what the fractional reserve banking system is. And for instance, nobody would understand or would really understand that when every day of the week we have some commentator on the news, on the ABC and other stations, telling us what the pundits think the interest rate will be. Whether the bank will change it, whether the Reserve Bank will change it. And this is sort of subliminal advertising almost. People hear it all the time and they think, well, that's all right because we hear it all the time and it must be valid. But when you think about it, if the Australian interest rate, say today, the benchmark rate set by the Reserve Bank is 4%, and that means that it then licenses all the other commercial banks in Australia to lend money at that rate, and we know that they can lend 9 times as much money as they've got. Think about that. That means if you do that, you get 4% 9 times. Right? Not a bad return. Not a bad return. And they're still not happy with that.
For doing nothing. For doing absolutely nothing. For having the license to print the money, they have the license to make exorbitant amounts of profit. That's all they do. They do not produce a single thing of worth in that job description.
Exactly. And any commentator, politician, financier, whatever, who was honest and worth his salt would say that. But of course, you wouldn't get any airtime on the ABC or any other station.
Except Radio Fremantle.
Well, that's right. When I say station, I mean the mainstream stations. You just don't get heard. And if you were to to try to teach that at university, for instance, you wouldn't have a job. That's how it works. And that's why people do not know. This is a slavery system. It's a very subtle system of slavery. It's much better than the system used in the Middle Ages, where the average peasant probably had to spend 30% of his time working for the lord of the manor, and the rest of his productivity went to himself and his family. Today, if you only had to give 30% to government and others, you would be laughing.
Yeah.
For instance, the money you pay on your mortgage is entirely a tax for the benefit of private corporations.
Yeah.
None of that money, in a proper system, money would be. If we don't have a valid constitution or valid government or valid judiciary or anything else in Australia, but if we did, if we were a genuine, say, Republican community and we had a real say in what happens, we would create our own money. The system would be transparent. It would be controlled. The money would be debt free. It wouldn't be usurious. There'd be no interest to pay, and the money would simply be used as a form of means of exchange through society. And the way to encourage it to be effective and to stop people hoarding it would be to, say, issue it every year, to run for a year and then to be recalled and replaced. And the money that you recall, you might only replace it with 95 or 90% new money. So in other words, it loses value as the year goes on or as time goes on. That encourages people to spend it. So the velocity of spending the money increases, and that means that there's more activity occurring. It's the direct opposite of what is happening today with the bailouts and so on, where these private organisations like the Federal Reserve in America, which is not a federal and it's not a reserve, it's another lie. They issue trillions of dollars. That money then goes to commercial banks, which get the money at, say, 0.25% interest, then lend it back to the American Treasury, the US Treasury, at, say, 3% or 4%, and they pocket the difference. They're supposed to be...
another tremendous windfall for absolutely nothing at all.
Absolutely nothing, and they pay billions of dollars in bonuses to their senior staff. That money, to be effective in the system at all, would have to be lent to Main Street, to ordinary businesses and people.
Which it's not.
Which it's not, because it's much easier simply to give it back to the US Treasury and make money for nothing. And they know that. They know that. It's just how long they think they can keep this system going.
Yeah.
It's got to collapse. And they're just so greedy and so stupid with it. They've been so effective for so long that they probably can't believe that they can't just keep doing it. But eventually the US economy will collapse, just as the EU economies will collapse. Australia is in a bubble of its own for some reason, largely because of, and you know this in Western Australia, because of the mining boom and because China wants so much of our raw materials. But we too will be feeling the pinch very soon. Once other countries really collapse, so we will, of course.
Can I just make another comment there? It's true as well, but given that China is buying up so much of our commodity, and that in itself is ironic, given that, at least the Chinese are getting something for the money they spend. They're getting our commodities, whereas we're getting more of this fiat, illusionary money that's worth nothing and will provide no sustenance when everything goes boom. But hey, that's part of the problem. It's really interesting as well, Ron. Maybe you could comment a little bit about this as well. You already briefly mentioned it, but I do note here again on one of your essays that you've published here, you did mention it. About 95% of U.S. money is issued as credit, and at most 5% of money in circulation is physical currency issued by government mints representing real wealth or goods and services held by borrowers. So technically, what that means is that of all the money that is circulating in the world, and it's like a matrix. Have you seen that movie, Ron? Have you seen The Matrix?
I haven't actually.
Oh, Ron, you got to see it. It's crazy because it talks about the idea that we're living in an illusory reality that is so far from the truth, and yet everyone's plugged into this system. But this system of money as debt, 95% of the money that's circulating, literally, physically, as a manifestation, does not exist other than zeros on a screen. Is that right?
Exactly. We tend to think of money as a thing, but it isn't.
It's not even a thing.
Instead of realising it's an idea,
Yeah.
given collective support by human consciousness, that's all. If people realise tomorrow what we're talking about, that system would cease to exist.
Yeah.
And our world would be in chaos until we got something new, but it's a total illusion, and the fact is that it may have been 95, 97% digital money in the recent past, but I probably would have said that sort of thing before the big $1 trillion bailout fundings that have been going on for some years. Nowadays, I would think that factoring in those new many trillions of dollars of bailout funding, digital money, going into the system, that the real money, the coins and notes in the system would be down to a fraction of 1%. That's what I would think it would have come to by now.
It's completely mind-boggling. I can't even quite fathom it. And to think as well that this wealth that people accrue, this wealth of supposed money, which people assume by itself has value, which we've certified that it doesn't, and so people with millions of dollars, millions of these fiat, this creational, fictional method of exchange are wealthy in our society. So you don't need to have a real trade. You don't even need to create things. You don't need to produce anything from land. You don't need anything. But in this matrix, if you have some zeros created from a computer screen from a bank, you could be a wealthy individual. It does seem incredibly unjust and unfair.
Well, of course it is. But it's just a criminal system, and it can't last. The amazing thing to me is that it has lasted as long as it has. Fiat systems historically have only lasted a maximum of 70 years.
70,
70, I think it is, yes. And now this one has gone longer than that.
This one's gone quite a time. Didn't you say it was 1694 or some such? They first...
Oh, no, the system, what I'm talking about now is the fiat system introduced in 1913 with the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank in America.
Oh, okay.
That's when this latest phase took hold, and the Federal Reserve Bank is now really the central bank for the whole world. And that system's been going since 1913, so it's almost 100 years, which is well beyond any other historic example, including those in China way back. I think it probably has lasted so long because the bankers also control the global mass media, as well as virtually all the governments in the world. Certainly all the governments in the Western world, but almost all the others. The exception, to my mind, would be Russia today, and I guess China. I don't really know what China is doing.
Yeah.
But they control all the information that people in the West tend to see.
So this... Sorry.
I was just going to say, the internet's our only saviour.
Yeah, and it's proving to be quite a tool in the right hands. Hopefully we'll see the manifestation of that continue and develop. But I was just wanting to revisit what that point you made about the fractional reserve systems generally lasting no more than 70 years. That's quite an accurate figure. What happens to them? Why do they only last 70 years?
Well, because of greed and stupidity, the people issuing the money can't help themselves. They issue too much money. It's exactly what's happened in America.
Is happening right now.
Well, it basically has happened. It's how it's still surviving. One doesn't know. See, before this latest splurge of issuing of trillions of dollars of digital money to bail out banks and so on, the original value of a dollar in 1913, when the system started, was now worth about 4 cents. But
4
today
cents.
it's 4 cents, but it's probably a good deal less now if you could figure out how much inflation has been fed into the system with the issue of trillions of dollars of bailout funding.
This fiat illusionary money, which just so basically they print money, they print themselves into oblivion, is what happens.
That's right. Eventually, see, even like the tulip fantasy in Holland, eventually things become so.
That's an interesting
even
example.
Stupid
Could you
humanity
give that?
can't bear it any longer.
Can you give that example? I've heard of that. There was the boom, the tulip boom, or something in the Netherlands, in Holland.
I haven't got the figures in front of me, but they were paying thousands, maybe tens of thousands of dollars, whatever, for a single tulip bulb and so on, and you couldn't even be sure what would happen with it.
Yeah, that was an interesting example. That I'd heard briefly about that, and that went bust as well. The tulip boom.
Yeah, you can't continue beyond a certain point. Prosperity depends on people doing physical things, producing goods and services, and that's what abundance is about, and that's why our world will eventually move to a very soon, hopefully, we'll move to a system where people resume responsibility for their own lives and, in fact, do produce goods and services instead of increasingly chasing the production of artificial money. In fact, goods and services are the only form of value. Even gold and silver is only a value because of the effort required to mine it and so on. The same with salt, or you name it.
We're actually coming up to the end of the first half of our show, Ron. So we might just take a break in a few moments. Can I just add one thing to sum up, and you can just shoot back at me and tell me if you think this is correct. Are we basically saying then, can we take away from this first part of the interview that basically money as it stands, as it should function in a society that is functional, is purely and totally a method of exchange, and if that currency is taken over by private interests and taken over in the to forward an advantage, a private organization over the advantage of the community at large and the people within that society, it is doomed to fail. Could we take it? Would you say
absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely, but it's doomed to fail if anyone, including the government or the king or whoever is issuing it, ceases to do it properly and in accordance with the needs of the people within the community that the money is supposed to serve. It has to relate to the community for which it's a tool. That's all it is. And the moment people start to use it as a means to exploit others, the system is on the road to failure. It's just a question of how long it takes.
Well, I think that's a wonderful way to finish this first half, Ron. So we're going to take a quick break, drink and a limber stretch, and you're listening to The Source, 107.9 FM Radio Fremantle. Our special guest all the way over from the East Coast of Australia, Ron Chapman, Regional Director for the organisation Abundant Hope. We're talking about money tonight, folks. Money, what is it, why is it, and what we should be doing with it. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back, folks. This is the second part of our our interview with Ron Chapman here on the Source 107.9 FM. We're talking to Ron Chapman about money, what it is, why it is, and what we need to be doing with it. Now, as we start this second section, I just wanted to comment briefly from one of Ron's own essays on money, fiat debt money, and this is, I think, very pertinent to the last section of the interview we were just talking about, and I'm just going to go right into it here. There can never be enough money to pay fiat debt money interest, and so there is always a chronic shortage of money in the system. The only remedy for that shortage of money is issuance of more credit, that is, creation of ever more fiat debt money. That credit creation results in ever greater liability for the payment of interest, so that the debt spiral does not just continue, it gets worse almost exponentially. This vicious debt spiral gets worse until the credit bubble finally bursts with catastrophic economic and social effects. Moreover, the longer the illusion continues to operate before the bubble bursts, the greater the destruction of community wealth and loss of community welfare will be when lending declines, either through refusal of banks to lend or inability of people to borrow. Now, I would say, Ron, that is pretty accurate. What you wrote there is pretty much symptomatic of exactly where we stand right now. So would you say that's an accurate depiction of where we are right now?
I think it's a very accurate depiction. The money system is a mind control mechanism, but the practical effects are becoming extremely obvious. But people don't want to believe them.
I think we're seeing it. I mean, it is more exaggerated at this time in some of the countries in the European Union. Obviously, Australia is not quite seemingly to have feeling the effects. But if you take, for example, Greece, Portugal, Ireland, you know, these pigs nations here, this group of nations that are the weakest in the European community, they're already seeing this systematic destruction of their financial systems, and also intertwined with that, the loss of jobs. There's no manufacturing, there's no jobs, there's no people losing their houses, everything. I mean, it's like the first dominoes of a major catastrophe. I mean, is that accurate?
I think that's very accurate. You get places like Greece where farmers are now taking their potatoes to the markets on a Saturday and selling them at a base rate, and they still do better than trying to sell them through the system.
Right.
And that, in some ways, this is a good thing. Good can come out of chaos. In effect, people in those countries are having to face the fact that they lived in a fool's paradise and that the system doesn't work. It's very hard to tell people these things until they feel it in their own personal experience.
Yeah, I would agree with that, definitely.
I think Australia is in a bubble, and we don't realise that we're on the edge of the cliff.
I think there are signs, though, Ron. I mean, you see the retail sector down 40%. They're going through the lowest trough that they can possibly remember. People are not spending money. There's this deflation in the prices of housing that isn't going away. I mean, that's been an Australian icon of the wealth of this country has been the success of real estate and the way in which people own their own homes, and the value of that has increased. But at this stage, it's not happening. We're starting to see that bubble begin to burst. Would you say we're seeing that as well here?
I think it is, but the big one in Australia probably will be the housing market. And whilst the unit market is well down in sales, the actual prices are only down from less than 1% in, say, the ACT to around 6% in the worst affected places, which is, of course, chicken feed compared with what will happen and what has happened in America. You know, when you lose 40% of the value of your home, you'd take notice.
Mm, mm.
People are still probably in the mindset of, at worst, the 1990 recession we had to have in Australia. I doubt if they even see it in those terms yet.
You know, as a small aside to that, I just couldn't help but recall in the United States of America currently there are examples in certain towns in certain parts of the country where houses literally go for tens of dollars. They can't get rid of them. They're just derelict
Yep.
communities where people have no longer been able to afford or sustain these communities, and there's ghost towns of places with no one in them. It's that bad.
Yeah, they can't afford. People can't even afford to pay the rates or the charges on the property. And of course, the banks are bulldozing lots of places now in order to reduce the overhang of properties.
And it's would you I think this is an aspect that a lot of people don't understand, and I think it's also symptomatic of the kind of country we are, this island continent that almost does feel like the arse end of the world sometimes, that's somehow dislocated from the larger global community. Nothing's really, and that is none more accurate than in Western Australia. I'll tell you that right now, Ron, because we really are as far away as we can possibly be and still yet be part of the global community. People, I think, tend to get to the idea that somehow we operate independently from a global community, somehow that we aren't affected, or somehow that we wouldn't see those nasty side effects that we're seeing now being a lot more apparent in European and countries in the United States. It's not true, is it, Ron, that we are independent, we can escape somehow unscathed, as Aussies tend to think they do. We're the lucky country, you know, we somehow can operate and go forward without anyone else's help.
It certainly isn't true, Ben. The truth is almost the opposite. Globalisation has us in its grip. It's got the whole world in its grip, but Australia is almost leading the pack. If it wasn't for the fact that the Chinese have been spending US dollars like confetti,
to get rid of
our raw materials.
Well, it is worthless after all.
Yeah, and the truth is we'll be using them for wallpaper before the end.
Or toilet paper.
Yeah, that's the problem. It's everything's a state of mind, and Australians are still not focused.
Yeah. And what about the fact that the central bank of central bank, this Federal Reserve that you've mentioned in the first half of our interview, again, it's not a federal organisation. It's not a reserve either. It is a private conglomerate of banking interests that have been mandated to print money. And as the central bank of central banks, the United States currency is the reserve currency. I think people tend to forget as well the fact that the Central Bank of Australia, or the Federal Reserve Bank of Australia, is a part of that greater kind of system, as it were. As in, if the Central Bank of central banks of the United States suffers and goes down, so too will all the other central banks that feed off of her. Is that accurate?
Oh, absolutely. When the federal, I understand the Chinese actually own the Federal Reserve now, but if that system collapses, or the European Central Bank collapses, then the global system will collapse. Some countries will do better than others. The countries that are really likely to do best will be the BRIC countries. That's Russia, China, Brazil, South Africa, India. Those countries are now in the throes of creating their own trade links and their own bank, their own development bank.
They're intentionally decoupling right now, aren't they?
Exactly.
They're trading amongst
and
themselves.
That will cause, if nothing else does, that will cause the US dollar to slump drastically, eventually to collapse. Now, they're trying to do it. I think the BRIC countries like China are trying to do it slowly, because let's face it, China still has $1 trillion worth of US
Treasuries.
dollars,
Yeah, yeah.
which, in my view, they would have been better off dumping their exports to America in the sea, taking it out to sea and dumping it rather than taking it all the way to America just to get American dollars for it. But because what are you going to do with them, really?
Yeah.
The Americans have stopped them buying major assets in the US, I think, with the Chinese buying major assets in the US with their dollars. And if they can't do that, if they can't buy the assets there or elsewhere, they're buying them in Australia, of course, then the money could become nearly worthless.
As it does appear to be doing right now.
Yeah.
So okay, so well that's good that we've clarified that. But I just wanted to speak a bit more, if I could, about this idea of usury. If we can switch, well, not really switch gears a little bit. It's the same deal basically. But can you talk a bit about exactly what is usury as a banking practice, and can you talk a bit about, in terms of your understanding, where it come from and how somehow this practice was implemented into world banking, into financial practices?
Well, I mean, the history of it probably goes back to Babylon and beyond. It's simply charging people an interest rate for the use of money.
So is it debt? Is usury debt? Is that basically is it
Well,
interchangeable?
it's the mechanism of debt. If I charge you interest, that's usury, and that of course means that you've got a debt to me that you've got to repay. It was banned by the Christian churches for a long time. It's banned by the Muslims. These are good reasons for, now the Christians, of course, have embraced it, but it's a good reason for attacking the Muslims because they still don't believe in it, or in theory don't believe in it. They want those who provide the money to put some skin in the game. In other words, if I'm in business and I want money from you, you then have an interest in my business rather than getting me to pay you money without any risk. So you have a risk in my business. Then that's much more real, I think, than the current usury system, which the bank wins no matter what. And it's worse than that because the bank actually has rigged the books such that overall the system is a closed system, and a percentage of those borrowers in the system have to fail on a regular basis, and the banks then win. They don't just come out even; they actually get the assets for pennies on the dollar, or it can be as little as pennies on the dollar. So usury is basically it's wanting to obtain unearned income. Really, it's
getting money for nothing, huh?
Yeah, it's a lazy person's way of living.
Yeah, you do have here as well. I refer again to one of your essays here. Usury is the root of all evil. Free money is essential to prosperity and abundance. Usury now defined as charging excess interest, but originally it meant merely charging a fee or interest for the use of money. So is that so? What is that saying technically? That nowadays usury, they define it more as charging an exorbitant interest rate.
Well, yeah, that's just specious argumentation, really, but it's true. And it's also true that if you think about it, if a bank is charging 4 or 6% interest, even 4%, if it's charging 4% interest on 9 times or 10 times as much money as it's got, that has to be exorbitant.
You must admit, you must imagine as well, who decides what is an exorbitant rate of usury? If you asked the majority of people's opinion, you get back here again to the idea that what's good for the community should be the way we implement a kind of money system. What is an exorbitant usury rate? I would imagine any usury exorbitant. I wouldn't
In,
want it
any
at all.
interest, any interest is exorbitant, yes, because really money is simply a mechanism for encouraging people to work, if you like, and every community should organise that for itself. You shouldn't have unemployment or wasted resources simply because the mechanism for getting them to work is not available because somebody chooses not to make it available. Obviously, the ability to have people at work is available in any community. The American colonies used to do this in the times. The Massachusetts colony issued scrip back in shortly before the Bank of England was set up, I think, or might have been after it, set up its own scrip, which was just paper money, if you like. $7,000 worth wasn't much, but it was enough to encourage people to employ each other and to work, and so they were prosperous. And the British bankers didn't like that, and so they got the British Parliament to ban the use of that colonial scrip, which was, in other words, a community issuing its own money to enable people to work. There was no interest on it. It was just issued and went round and round in circles, if you like, employing people. Shortly, within a year after the British Parliament banned this money, there was gross unemployment in the colonies, and they fell upon hard times. Now, that's not an accident. That was deliberate. The bankers do this sort of thing because, first of all, they want to make all the profit. But I think it goes further. Well, in my view, it goes further than that. They actually are. It's a form of divide and conquer. See, money is a mind control mechanism designed to separate people from each other, to isolate people, have them compete with each other, see each other as competitors, if not enemies. Now that effectively destroys your community. And if you look at modern American or Australian community, you see how far that strategy has gone.
It's
Money
gone very well.
has just about isolated everyone. You've got to the stage where not only have you destroyed extended family, but you've just about and reduced it to nuclear families. But nowadays we've gone a step further, and you're down to one-parent families. You can't get any lower than that and still have any viable family or community structure at all. We've gone about as far as we can go.
And I think it's true, Ron, as well. This idea, like you said, as a mind control mechanism. I've seen it said. I've read it said that for many people, money can become as God for many people because it has lost its original meaning as purely a method of exchange in order to precipitate trade and to put people to work. It has taken on a worth of its own through these duplicitous, fraudulent, fractional banking systems, and therefore it's become something that literally rules the lives of people within society. I mean, was that a fair comment, do you think?
I think so. I think that the money mechanism, the money meme, has been foisted on society for hundreds of years, many hundreds of years, and it's reached its peak of effectiveness at deconstructing society, if you like. It's another form of divide and conquer. It's the most pernicious and effective form of all, I think, because it gets to the heart of society, the root of society. It gets down to the individual, the family and the individual. You even have families fighting over money now, so that there's your famous iron ore family over in WA fighting in the courts at the moment.
The Hancocks.
Hancocks, yes.
Yeah, that's getting pretty dirty.
So It's a mechanism for the breakup of relationships and society. It's a deliberate program, in my view, by those who in fact do control humanity and the planet.
I think so as well. I'd agree 100% with you on that one, Ron. And I think it's important maybe to remind people as well. You have mentioned it earlier in the interview today, but the idea that this system of exchange, a lot of people might listen to what you're saying, what we're talking about this evening, and say, well, you know, that's all well and true, but this is the system that we've chosen, and this is how everything works. It's got nothing to do with us. It's just simply the way the world works, and this system of financial interchange works. But it's crucial, I think, to really hammer home that this current fractional reserve system, this means of debt creation and slavery, is our choice, 100% our choice. Or in terms of the fact that most people are ignorant to how these things are run, through their ignorance have chosen to allow people to make our decisions for us who do not have the best interests of the community at heart, and therefore, you know, we have been, what's the term I'm looking for, involved in the process, even in our ignorance of allowing this thing to occur. But it is still our choice, isn't it, Ron? This only happens the way it does, and the suffering and the pain and the misery that millions of people are going through in the world right now through this system of fractional reserve banking is purely our choice.
I agree. It's a subtle choice in the sense that people tend to turn away from what is too difficult to contemplate. The truth is, the social controllers have got people believing they are isolated and alone, and that they need money rather than relationship to give them security. You know, that's bullshit. And to give them security and self-worth. And since once they're in that state of mind, they're vulnerable and easily manipulated. But the moment you face the pain of the fact that you are in a difficult situation, you can start looking for options. You can start saying, well, is there anyone that I can try to relate to? Is there anything I can do? Can I start growing vegetables in my backyard? Whatever. What's happened is, instead of living in strong communities that combine their resources collectively, what happens is people are atomised into isolated units. And once you do that, you become dependent, whether you like it or not. You're dependent on welfare government or charities of various sorts. The alternative, of course, is something like the Amish communities, where they don't believe in, for example, insurance. You know, insurance is another scam. We don't need insurance. We don't need all of those things. What we need is proper, strong community life. The Amish, for instance, if your barn or your house burns down, the community gets together and they build a new one. You don't have to have a third-party corporation profiting on the side and having employees and so on, and boards of directors who make a fat profit of the matter. When something happens, you fix it. And we need to go back to that sort of community lifestyle, I think, where there are no middlemen in the sense that we've become used to it. When you look at our society today, there is so much work done which is useless work. It is absolutely useless. Everything from accountancy, insurance, advertising, the bulk of it is not necessary. But of course, to look at that, if I was employed in any of those those industries or functions, my first reaction is probably to think, oh, what would I do? I'd be out of work. And whilst that might be true, do you really enjoy the work you're in? And wouldn't you be better off in a thriving community in which you put your shoulder to the wheel when needed in the interests of everyone, and when it wasn't needed and you had spare time, you could do whatever you chose to do? That's the future for us. We will be in a state of abundance the moment communities organise together to look after each other instead of competing with each other.
I would agree with that, Ron, but I'd also press you in the point that you mentioned it's a subtle choice, and I think, you're probably correct. And again, I think it's a more subtle choice because, in general, most of the population is living from a series of malaise here with living in the illusion too long. They don't understand the true nature of what they're dealing with. But you do mention, for instance, again, this in one of your essays, a precondition for manifesting this money illusion. You talk about, if I can paraphrase, that the power and privilege involved in issuing and regulating money are sovereign rights. They belong to the nation, to all the people in the community. Moreover, that sovereign right must be exercised equitably in the interests of all individuals in the society without exception. Now, I could go on with that. You're quite thorough in your analysing that material, but I would say that given the fact that it is a sovereign right and a responsibility as a nation, number one, we've given that right and responsibility over to private interests who do not have the greater interests of the community at heart. And also, when people such as Australians live in a society that they term themselves as a democracy, people have this idea that they're living in a democracy, that they tell the government what to do, that they tell the government what needs to be done, the government does what they need to be done. People walk around boasting about the democracy of the world they live in, and yet at the same time, this pivotal function of society as a method of exchange has been given to foreign powers in the interest of foreign organisations. And I think it's just brutally necessary for people to stand up and make the government do what they want them to do, i.e. bring this system of barter and trade, a money in whatever form, to bring it back to what it was essentially created to perform, and that was simply as a means of trade and commerce.
Well, of course, you're right. The difficulty is that we're at the end of centuries of organised enslavement, centuries, probably millennia, really. This current system evolved during the American Civil War, as I understand it, when the British bankers told the American bankers that they'd be happy for the Negroes to be freed, the chattel slavery to cease, and they would use wage slavery in the future. That is what happened, and that's now what's happened. What we've got today is a massive global plantation in which every nation is sort of a separate farm, and the overseers of those farms are sort of puppet politicians placed there by the banksters who virtually own the nations, and therefore control everything.
Can I give you this quote? I'm sorry to interject,
Yep,
Ron, but this
sure.
is a quote from one of your materials as well. In July 18, this is illustrating exactly what you're talking about, that they abolished this overt form of chattel slavery. And it says here in one of your essays, in July 1862, in the middle of the war, the Hazard Circular was sent by London banksters to US banksters. This was the War of Independence, I imagine.
No, it would have been the American Civil War.
Civil War, I do
1862.
apologise. Yep. Civil War, you're right there, it's 1862.
And remember that the Civil War was funded on both sides by the bankers.
This is just one paragraph here, but it says it all. Yep. This was in that Hazard Circular. Yep. Slavery is likely to be abolished by the war power and chattel slavery destroyed. This I and my European friends are in favour of, for slavery is but the owning of labour and carries with it the care of the labourers, while the European plan, led by England, is that capital shall control labour by controlling wages. This can be done by controlling the money. The great debt, national debt, that capitalists will see to it is made out of the war, must be used as a means to control the volume of money. To accomplish this, the war bonds must be used as a banking basis. We are now waiting for the Secretary of Treasury to make this recommendation to Congress. So they understood the fact that this overt form of slavery was actually more hard work than it was worth, and they could literally do nothing, as you've suggested. They didn't have to work for it at all by simply controlling the flow of the money. Is that accurate?
That's dead right. That is a very a very apposite quote. It really highlights the fact that the bankers knew exactly what was happening, and that it underlines the fact that the bankers created the American Civil War, just as they create all wars, and this illustrates the fact that what we now have is something which replaces both slavery and feudalism. It's basically free-range serfdom. And the beauty of free-range serfdom, you know, the wage slavery that we now know, is that the owners don't have to look after the people at all.
No, they
don't have to look after the workers at all. You've got to pay for your own shelter as well as your own healthcare and education and transport, you name it, and then you pay taxes
on top of that.
Yeah. So
it's a subtle form of slavery, isn't it? It
extremely
is
subtle, but extremely real
and effective, incredibly effective.
Yep.
Because I think it foisters as well, Ron, the idea that we're not slaves. A lot of people, you would venture the idea in a public forum that people are enslaved. In an Australian public forum, they would laugh. They would laugh at you.
Well,
they would ridicule.
They'd laugh at you or be angry. Yeah.
Yeah, they would find it utterly ridiculous because they say, I live in the land of the free, and Australia is a free democracy. That they understand with that what they will, but they would literally ridicule the idea. But the fact is quite clear. Through the money, through this fractional debt system, these bankers are able to control the entire system, the entire financial system all around the world.
Yes, they not only does it sort of vacuum up most of the money going directly to them, but you see they then are able to use it to buy everything and everyone. So that, for instance, the American Congress is almost bought to a man. It's either bought or suborned and otherwise harassed, such that you get Benjamin Netanyahu getting 29 standing ovations for talking to Congress. This sort of thing. That's absurd. The situation here is the same. We don't have a lawful or even a legal government or constitution. We have a supposedly democratic society in which those who run the society, who control the parliament and all the state parliaments and judiciaries and so on, have no legitimacy whatsoever. People don't know that. They have no idea about anything, really. Our constitution, for instance, in Australia is simply a part of a British colonial act. That's all it was and is. It wasn't even legal, let alone lawful, in 1901 because the monarch didn't sign it into law. Queen Victoria didn't even sign it.
Yes, and I have that information because we were thinking of getting into the illegitimacy of the Australian government, but and we'll do that in a future exploration. But can I bring us back, Ron, if I can? I'm just weary of our time tonight for the interview. I want to get a little bit more in about the specifics of money. Can you touch on briefly? You've done again one of the works that you've authored here about the creating of trillions of worthless fiat dollars out of thin air, which is causing this inflation and depression. I think if we can delve a little more deeply into taking a snapshot of where we are right now and how we got here, I'll just if I can lead us in with another bit of your work here. By globally coordinating their so-called money creation activities, the central banks can create booms and busts almost at the press of a button. The current global financial meltdown, though, has developed because banks are wary of lending, i.e. creating money out of thin air to lend to borrowers at the level needed to maintain a steady growth in actual economic activity in the real global economy. Why? Because their previous excessive lending, i.e. creation of fiat money for fraudulent activities like subprime mortgages and derivatives bets of various kinds, has created enormous losses, especially for large US banks, and most of those losses are yet to be put on their balance sheets. When they are, and the deadline for that accounting in the US is said to be, well, this one's 1st of October 2009, I'm not sure if they did, virtually all big US banks will be officially bankrupt. Now that's one of the lead-in statements you make in that particular work. Is that basically what we're looking at here as the doomsday scenario for the current fiat central reserve banking system? Is that's why we're at where we're at right now?
Well, I mean, they've been juggling the bankruptcy of the major banks in the US and Europe for many years now, in an honest system with an honest judiciary and so on, globally, or in the US even, they'd be bankrupt. But they essentially the people running the US and the world are criminals, and they're controlled by banking criminals. So the system will last as long as, as long as they can make it last. How long that will be, I can't say, but probably the pressure will come from the people below. The original system in 1913 was set up. Basically, what did Congress get out of it in 1913? Well, they got out of it the right to call up any amount of money at any time. Essentially, they would simply ask. Yeah, they'd call upon the Federal Reserve for money, and the Federal Reserve would issue it and then charge interest on it, which is ludicrous. I mean, the Congress can create its own money, but for some reason the politicians then thought that was a good thing because they wouldn't have to tax people directly to get the money for whatever they needed, and for some time that seemed to work. But essentially that is it sort of grows exponentially, that debt, because in effect what the system created was the Federal Reserve would issue the money and charge interest on it. The interest would never be the interest would be paid via taxation. The IRS was another private corporation set up at the same time to collect the money and feed it through to the banksters, and that's what happened, and is still occurring apparently. But the principal never gets repaid, and the system just grows and grows and grows. We have the only reason that it hasn't collapsed is that those who control these things and the media that they control don't tell the people the truth.
It carries on the illusion.
We live in a global matrix in every way. We live in a sea of lies. There's almost nothing that I ever come across these days which is the truth in terms of the system under which global society lives. Everything seems to be a scam and a lie. Now, people don't believe that, and they think you're crazy to even raise it. And you were talking before about Australians just not being able to get their head around the fact that we do live in such a system. What can you say? People will not do the research. They will not do the thinking. The ultimate end will be they would have to be hit between the eyes by reality, which ordinarily means, a global world war or a global major depression, whatever.
Economic collapse. If I can borrow again here, because I think you put it quite succinctly, The futile effort to bail out banks and others that have enormous exposure to derivative losses has created another problem: potential hyperinflation. Why? Because the 12.8 trillion US dollars conjured out of thin air by Congress and the Fed in 2008 had no asset backing of any kind, and so it simply adds to inflation. That is the huge increase in the money supply going on ever since the Fed was established in 1913, so that today the US dollar only buys what 4 cents would have bought in 1913. Among other things, this means that house and other asset prices have not really increased overall. Rather, the dollar has been grossly devalued. And I really would imagine, Ron, that we are getting, and again, this is my opinion here, but we must be getting close to tipping point. I don't know how tenable this situation can continue to remain when the printing press is simply printing worthless paper ink, dollar valued dollar bills that have no intrinsic value whatsoever. Surely, I think your prediction of the 70-year cycle must be fairly accurate, and we have overstayed our welcome in this system, and it must be close to a final bust up at this point.
Well, yeah, I've thought that for some years. I'm beginning to wonder whether the criminals in charge of the global economic system and financial system aren't being subtly assisted by our friends upstairs, really.
Yeah.
I just don't know how they could put it this way. If you wanted to, and you had any sort of ability in that area, you surely could collapse the system.
If you wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, anyone with real financial muscle, for instance, anyone who really had plenty of gold or whatever. But I'm amazed that the system is surviving as long as this.
Well, I also wanted to. We are coming towards the end of our interview allotment, unfortunately, and I think we've done pretty well clarifying some of the aspects to what money is and where it's taken us to this point. Can I just? I wanted to finish off by talking about and also a topic that you've made me more aware of here as to why humanity will live without money. And I think it's fair to say that you're of the opinion that after this system does finally implode upon itself, we will move into a paradigm in which humanity will become less inured with this fractional reserve banking system and maybe replace it with something else. Is that accurate?
Yes, I think it's inevitable that this system will collapse. The fact is, well, what can you say? The capitalist global economic system is based on two mechanisms. The first one is the monetary mechanism, and the second is the symbiotically co-dependent with that is that money mechanism is the labour for income mechanism. So once you've got people mind controlled to believe that they have to have money and that they have to work for that money and that their labour is simply worth whatever somebody will pay for it, then labour becomes a commodity in the open market. The fact is, though, that since the Great Depression exposed the fact that humanity has already reached the stage of being able to produce as much as it wants. Right? Despite World War One, they still were in a situation that the Great Depression occurred because humanity could produce as much as it needed. Now, that was because of improvements in mechanisation and so on. And that process of productivity increase has gone on exponentially, really, to the point today where electronics and so on have greatly reduced the number of people needing to work people to work in the way that we used to do. So the need for a new paradigm is obvious. If you don't have, if you have increasingly unemployment, then people aren't earning money. The only way the controllers coped with that was foisting the welfare
System.
government on us, so that everybody started to believe in that meme too. They believed there's another mind control meme which says that the government owes me a living and they've got to look after me. But there comes a point when there's so few people employed, so relatively few people employed, that the government can't steal from them enough of their productivity to maintain the existence of those who are unemployed. At that point, the system has to break down, and that's pretty close to occurring now. What they have done, of course, to conceal that is, in various ways, they've done a lot of work creation in the form of everybody has to
work for the dole.
Well, yeah, but also in ordinary jobs, people had to account for 6 and 10 minute slabs of their time during the workday, and they had to record that. Now that's a waste of time when you think about it. Not only does it mean that you don't trust the worker, but you waste his time recording somewhere on some computer what he did with those chunks of his day. And there are lots of other waste work mechanisms.
Could you see that we might return, maybe not completely without money, but to return to using money in the form that it was originally used and intended in a fair way, in that it maintains a function but purely just as a form of exchange rather than a debt incurring instrument?
We'll have to return to that. If there was no intervention, we would eventually have a major global collapse, and that would cause a breakup of nations and so on, and communities would start again, and some of them would fly right and some of them wouldn't. Those who flew right would prosper, and others would emulate them. If we get what hopefully we will get, which is intervention, then of course people will only use money in a proper way. It will be issued in the right way, controlled in the right way, and used in the right way, and we would prosper and abundance would occur very rapidly. And as abundance occurred, people would realise that they don't actually need the money. That, for instance, if your basic needs are met, then it's only the extras you want, and you may well barter for those or whatever.
Do you think that that kind of system is going to be conducive to maintaining the standards of living that people are accustomed to in these days? Or I think a lot of people might associate the idea of returning to that kind of idea of that form of currency exchange as a return to a more basic, primitive method of living. Are you saying that we could return to a system like that and yet still maintain the style of living that we're used to, or we would have to see a fundamental change in that as well?
Well, I mean, you're talking about mind control memes. Obviously, people will not be able to take their annual holidays and drive from major mall to major mall on shopping sprees. I mean,
which might not be a bad thing.
Yeah, but see, that's the sort of thing. If that's what you dream of doing, then that won't be available, nor should it be. And most people would start to realise it wasn't much fun anyway. I don't see any great decline in living standards in true intrinsic ways. What's important is relationships, not owning or controlling things.
Material possessions, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Ron, this has been absolutely fascinating and very important topic to delve into, and I'm so very glad that you've agreed to come on to the Source Rodeo program here for this interview. Now, we are coming to the end of our allotted time space, and I'm hoping we've covered everything that we had intended at the start. But we can always revisit if you might be willing to do this again on the Source. And now, can I just ask, is there any final thoughts you might like to leave with our audience on the program tonight?
Not really.
I
Just
mean, basically, I think one thing that I've learnt this evening is about the relevance and the real need to understand more about the nature of money and the paradigm we live in and how we use it, and maybe to entertain ideas about how we might improve that system. Is that fair?
that's fair. And as far as I'm concerned, money can't buy me love, right?
If only I had that song, I'd bring it up right now. No, well that's great, Ron. That's fantastic, and thank you so much for appearing on the program, Ron. Is it possible we might get you back for a rerun?
That's fine, Ben. I'd be happy to be. Hopefully next time I'll be a bit fitter.
Yes, I hope so too. After your little fall. Well, thank you so much again for appearing, Ron. Thanks very much. It's very much appreciated. So thanks very much, folks out there in Radio Land. This has been the third pre-recorded interview we've done on the program. This time with Ron Chapman, Regional Director of Organisation Abundant Hope, and Australian representative of that organisation, and we will be back with more on the next program. So I hope you've enjoyed this edition, and we'll see you at the same time next week on Thursday evening. Thanks very much, Ron.
Thanks, Ben. Bye.
Bye bye.